Thank you all very much. Coming to this conference from much the same background as Colm is coming, but being much more conscious of time than he is, I'm really going to be looking at what it is envisioning this Republic of Fairness, Equality and Justice looks like from a human rights perspective and also from a legal perspective, because that's what I do in my job. I'm a lawyer and we apply the law. And the values of equality and justice and fairness, if we try and think what would a republic look like that had those values, I suppose the things that strike me are that we would have a republic where everybody's basic dignity was protected, regardless of their economic status or their skin colour or other attributes that are very integral to their humanity and their human and to them being a human being. So the law of the land would protect the dignity of people. And in that republic as well of fairness, justice and equality, there would be people would know the law and people would respect it, picking up what Josephine was saying there about the need for law not just to exist, but to be accepted by the people. People would respect the law and they would respect the rights of others, knowing their own rights would be respected. And the other thing about the law would be that there would be accountability, so that where people transgressed, there would be sanctions, and where people would be entitled to call on the protection of the law if they need it and get redress where it was necessary. Now, saying all of that, I'm not talking utopia, because actually, when I was thinking about this, I thought, do you know what? We are nearly there. We are tantalisingly close in what we have in Ireland, and we don't actually require a massive amount of revolution. Some revolution, yes, but it's more revolution of thought than any other kind of a revolution. And why do I say that? I'm going to point to three different areas where I think, you know, if we looked at ourselves and if we took ourselves seriously and if we took these values seriously, we could accomplish it. And the first is that whole treasure chest we have of human rights law that, again, Colm spoke about with such eloquence. We have those laws embedded in our Constitution. And we know a bit about those. But I guess this is one of the few audiences in this country tonight that if I asked where else do we have human rights law, that we'd have loads of people who'd know, and I see some of the faces here of the people who would be able to tell me better than I can what those human rights are that we have, not just from our own constitution, but from our membership as a country in this world, where we have got so many binding, valid treaties and laws dealing with the rights of children, the right not to be discriminated against on the basis of race, the rights of prisoners, the rights of women, the elimination of discrimination against various groups of people, the rights of immigrants, the rights of people with disabilities. We have in Ireland, we have loads of law on this. But most law students will walk out of law college not knowing this law. I did it myself. I picked it up as I went along and I don't know it all yet. But we know there is an awful lot of law out there. But the people of this land know very little of that law. And they certainly don't know how it can be implemented. And that's for a very good reason. There is no domestic accountability for most of that law. Okay, there's a constitutional right to something in the Irish Constitution. I can rock up to the High Court and explain myself, and I'll talk a bit about that in a minute as well. But if I have, if I want to advocate my rights as a woman being discriminated against, or as an immigrant or whatever, I don't have a single forum in Ireland where I can go and explain my case and have that legally binding treaty implemented in my favour. For the most part, the courts are allowed to notice that these treaties exist. They are banned from applying them in the same way they would apply the Constitution, and there is nowhere else. So we're always being told we don't need these treaties incorporated into our law to any extent, because that's not the way it works. Well, there's no way it works, you see. That's the problem. And this is so fixable. It is so fixable to have a domestic forum in order to identify, is the state observing this legally binding treaty? If it is a trade treaty, not only will the state at the level of the Department of Foreign Affairs be very concerned about it, but every civil servant doing laws in that area will know every single thing about it, because there will be economic consequences about it. There are no similar consequences for failing to vindicate the human rights of people living in this land where there are binding laws. And that can be fixed. But again, laws aren't the only thing. Making laws isn't enough. You have to be able to implement them. And even in areas where we do have fundamental human rights that are legally adjudicated by our courts, it can be a case, like for instance in a case that FLAC has supported for the past 17 years, that a transgendered woman still doesn't have a birth certificate and identity document some 5 years now after the state conceded that it was a breach of her fundamental human rights not to give it to her. So you need to implement things as well. That's one way of implementing, making sure that things happen as they're meant to happen in line with court orders. The other issue is in relation to the courts and use of the courts. As anybody will tell you who's had any experience of them, they're slow, they're difficult. But if you're one of those people who's trying to have your rights proclaimed through the courts, you are totally chilled, to use the nice phrase, but totally put off is a better way of putting it. Because if you go to court to try and assert a right or assert that you're being treated unfairly, say by a large commercial institution, say by the state, say by people with power and influence, you will find that you will be told that the mechanisms aren't there to do that in a way that doesn't put every single cent you have at risk. So our courts at that level deflect and do not allow people to bring the kind of cases that they sometimes need to bring. There are ways of fixing that as well. Those kind of cases could be made manageable for people. But even if you take the ordinary level of courts, where people are not trying to proclaim big new rights, but simply get redress for the ordinary things that happen in their lives, what happens? There are delays, there's expense. If you are very poor and you need civil legal aid, you might wait for 18 months for a first appointment with your solicitor. If you're not extremely poor, you can't get legal aid. If your problem is before a social welfare tribunal or an employment appeals tribunal, there is no legal aid available at all, no matter how complex the legal issue and no matter how badly you need the assistance. If you say, I don't want to go to court, but I'd really like to use the Office of the Ombudsman or the Office of the Children's Ombudsman in order to complain, say, for instance, about, say, an asylum seeker in a direct provision centre or an immigrant or something, the Ombudsman and the Children's Ombudsman are prohibited from inquiring into issues such as these. So what's frustrating about all of this is that we actually have a fabulous court system by the standards of so much of the rest of the world. We have a constitution that says everyone has access to the courts, but it's like the old story, and again, I don't know whether the Ritz is the Ritz it used to be in London anymore, but you know, the story was always the doors of the Ritz are open to anybody, provided you have the money to go through it. We were working in FLAC recently on something where, for instance, if you had a whole group of people who were affected by the same action as, say, a big commercial body, So something like a medical claim. There's no facility in Ireland to take a class action. You can't band together and take one action against people. Everyone has to bring their own little action. And of course, it's easy to pick people off that way. So I was proposing something like this, and somebody said to me, that'll never happen. Why? Because it will only encourage litigation. And I was just thinking about that afterwards, and of course it didn't occur to me in time to say it. So if the person is in the audience, would you please listen now while I say it? There's no ban on litigation in Ireland. None, or almost none, if you have money. The only ban is if you don't have the time and the money to litigate. So class actions would encourage litigation by the poor, and that was what the problem was with them. So I'm going to finish on time, Anne. You just watch this. So I'll move into my third area, where I'm kind of trying to tee things up a little bit for tomorrow's discussion as well. And this is the whole area. I would say that in some ways that what I'm proposing is something we have already and only needs a shift of mindset. But somebody's bound to say to me, all those things you said, expanding the remit of the Ombudsman, making legal aid genuinely available to people who need it, all of these things are going to cost money. And we don't have the resources to do it, because that's the mantra all of the time. We don't have the resources to do it. Well, my answer to that is that we're not actually budgeting in accordance with law right now. I would say the way we budget in Ireland is actually wrong in law. This is if you take into account the obligation of the state, accepted freely under international human rights law, to set minimum standards below which nobody should ever have to drop, and that before you make decisions in relation to budgeting, you take the impact of those decisions on the most vulnerable in the state and apply it so that the most vulnerable are protected. This simply doesn't happen in Ireland. There is no general impact assessment done of the budget on how people are affected. If such an impact assessment was done, the little bit of money I'm looking for legal aid, or to expand the remit of the Ombudsman, or to put a domestic remedy in place to allow human rights to be interrogated at home, would be made available, because it is for the protection of the most vulnerable. But we don't do any of that. We are obliged in law to do it. But it's not, and I would say to the Irish government, I don't ever recall hearing at any stage that the government went and put it to the Troika or other people who are lending us money or other countries that we had these obligations. But I would equally say that two of the Troika have the same obligations to us. The European Union institutions are equally bound by the same obligations to justice, to fairness and to equality. And if they put us in a position where we are obliged to reduce the minimum standards of people with whom that they're dealing with in this country, if they reduce those minimum standards below a minimum core, then the European Union is itself every bit as much at fault as we are. And I haven't looked at all the IMF reports, but occasionally I've looked at the IMF reports. They always have paragraphs about the need to protect the most vulnerable in them. The European Union has a Charter of Fundamental Rights which sets it all out. Here are ways in which they are required to adjust what we are required to pay as well in order to preserve justice, equality and fairness. So my thesis is that in fact a little would do it. A change of priorities, a change of mindset, and we could be so much nearer that republic of justice, fairness and equality that we as a society really believe we need. So thank you very much for that.